Do you believe in setting boundaries, even if it means losing people?
No cake for me. That was the running joke in my family, though it was never told with humor and it never earned a laugh from me. Every single year, when Ryan's birthday rolled around, there were fireworks, hired photographers, caterers who arrived in vans with glossy logos, and tables that buckled under the weight of cakes so tall they needed rods to keep them from collapsing. I would sit in the background, smiling stiffly, holding a plate with some too sweet slice I hadn't asked for, and watch as my parents clapped their hands like proud producers unveiling their star. My own birthday, which inconveniently fell 2 months later, never carried the same weight. Some years there was nothing more than a store-bought cupcake and a muttered "Happy Birthday" as they shuffled past me on the way to Ryan's rehearsal dinner or his football practice. It wasn't that they forgot. It was that remembering me never mattered. The first time I realized how uneven things were, I was 9. Ryan, 12 at the time, got a full marching band for his birthday party in the backyard. I remember standing by the fence, listening to the drums, the brass, the ridiculous spectacle of it all, while the neighbor kids stared wide-eyed and whispered about how lucky he was. When my day came, my mother tapped her watch, sighed, and said she'd bake something if she had time after laundry. She didn't. My father handed me a $10 bill and told me to buy something fun, as if money was an equal substitute for attention. Even at 9, I understood what that meant. Ryan deserved celebration. I was an afterthought. The pattern never broke. At first, I told myself maybe I didn't need cake, balloons, or a guest list to feel important. Maybe being quiet meant I was stronger. But children grow into adults who carry the weight of those small humiliations like stones in their pockets, and over time, every missed candle and every shrugged-off achievement started to press down on me until I couldn't breathe without remembering it. Ryan would win Best Attitude in middle school and the living room would explode with relatives cheering, cameras flashing, champagne corks popping though he was underage. I graduated high school early with honors and my parents sent me a text, misspelled, as if typing my name correctly was a chore. By the time college came, I'd stopped expecting anything. Ryan's college send-off looked like a royal coronation, balloons shaped like crowns, my father renting out a hall, speeches about his bright future. When it was my turn, I got a car ride to campus in the family's old minivan and a reminder not to rack up debt. I lugged my own boxes up the dorm stairs while my parents waved out the window and reminded me to call when I had time. I told myself it was fine. I told myself to stay quiet. But silence isn't the same as peace. It's just the sound of someone swallowing what burns in their throat. It wasn't as if Ryan was cruel to me, not in the obvious ways. He never punched me, never told me I was worthless. Instead, he treated me the way everyone else in the family did, as though I was part of the scenery. He would smile at me across the table, pat my hand condescendingly, and then go back to talking about himself while my parents leaned in like disciples. The spotlight was fixed on him, and I was the dust floating just outside the beam. That kind of dismissal is worse than open hatred, because at least hatred admits you exist. The older I got, the sharper the contrast became. I worked part-time jobs all through school, paid for my own books, and ate discount meals while Ryan called home for emergency transfers to fund his spring break trips. He always got the money. I once called to ask for help when my rent was short, and my mother sighed heavily before telling me, "You should be more like your brother. He doesn't ask for handouts." I nearly laughed. The irony was so thick I could choke on it. But I didn't argue. I never did. I just said thanks and hung up, then went back to clocking extra hours at the campus coffee shop. For years, I trained myself to believe silence was strength. I convinced myself that staying quiet, nodding along, and pretending not to care was the smarter path, because at least it protected me from looking desperate. But the truth is silence is also a prison. Each year that passed, each birthday where Ryan got fireworks and I didn't even get a candle, built up like layers of concrete around me. I learned to move in narrow spaces, careful not to bump into their pride, careful not to demand too much. And yet, deep down, something in me was collecting every slight like receipts, saving them up for a day I couldn't even picture yet. That's the part no one in my family understood. They thought my quietness was weakness, that my ability to nod and disappear into the background meant I had accepted my role as the forgotten one. What they never noticed was that I was watching, remembering, and waiting. Every time the fireworks lit up the sky for Ryan while I stood in the shadows, I told myself I'd find my own spark one day, and when I did, it would burn brighter than anything they had ever given him. So I stayed quiet, yes. I let them laugh, let them celebrate him, let them look through me like I was air. But silence is never the end of the story. And I knew, even as I stood there year after year with no cake in front of me, that one day I'd have my own kind of fireworks. And I wasn't wrong. I used to think the worst part was the noise, the annual blast of light and smoke that followed Ryan through childhood like a parade float, but the truly corrosive part was the quiet afterward. The way my mother would gather paper plates and my father would slap Ryan's shoulder with theatrical pride while I stacked cups and pretended that being helpful was a personality. So when adulthood arrived and the rituals evolved from backyard fireworks to restaurant banquets where waiters balanced towers of desserts like circus acts, I realized the tradition had not faded so much as found a nicer venue and a bigger tab. At one of those dinners, in a glossy place that smelled like butter and expensive decisions, my parents toasted Ryan for a promotion that had more title than responsibility, and while I lifted my glass, my mother squeezed my elbow and told me I'd find my thing eventually, as if I were a lost umbrella and not a woman who kept her own bills paid and her own calendar full, and because I had learned the art of swallowing insults without choking, I told her I was happy for him, then watched the room whirl around my brother like a chandelier as he held court, while my father negotiated with the manager for a half-off fireworks dessert because our family loves tradition. What I did next surprised me not because it was risky, but because it felt like standing up inside my own skin for the first time in years, and because I prefer humor to speeches. I walked across the street to a bakery that displayed cakes as if they were delicate museum pieces, and I asked for a small chocolate one with a simple message in white icing that would slice through the room more cleanly than any knife. When I returned to the restaurant with my box and asked the staff to bring it out. After Ryan's flaming sugar tower, I was polite, I tipped, I smiled, and I could see the hostess file me under non-threatening, which suited me because the point of small revenge is not fireworks, but precision. When the time came, the waiters dimmed the lights and paraded in with Ryan's towering dessert that hissed and sparked, and everyone clapped as if applause were oxygen, and then, before the sugar smoke cleared, my cake arrived on a modest white plate with a message so tidy it could be embroidered on a throw pillow, to the producers of The Ryan Show, from the supporting cast. My mother blinked as if she had been slapped by a satin glove, my father chuckled and then didn't. Ryan looked confused in that particular way men look when the joke is obviously about them, but the punchline refuses to explain itself. And distant cousins tried not to laugh, which made their shoulders shake even harder, and I just took a forkful and said it tasted excellent, because nothing smells sweeter than control reclaimed. They tried to make it a teaching moment. My mother whispered that envy ages a woman faster than cigarettes. My father lectured me about family unity and how sarcasm erodes trust. Ryan grinned and told me he loved the banter, as though I were a warm-up act who had finally discovered a decent opener. Yet the air had shifted, because once you hang a mirror in a room, people either adjust their hair or storm out, and while they fussed, I looked at my phone and saw the company email that had been announced quietly a week earlier but absorbed by no one in my family since it didn't involve Ryan, a performance-based bonus pilot with a tier the size of a small miracle. The kind of number that could relocate your life from bland apartments with thin walls to places where the horizon sits in your bedroom window like a painting. And I realized my private ledger of swallowed slights had finally met an opportunity column wide enough to balance it. What I appreciate about corporate language is how it dresses brutality in business casual, and this memo was no exception, promising accelerated consideration for those who could hit benchmarks that read like dares, listing deadlines that spilled across holidays, and warning that only a handful would make it, the rest receiving a polite email template that would encourage them to continue striving, which is like receiving a pat on the head from someone taking your chair. I read it twice at the table while Ryan reenacted the story of his promotion for a new audience of relatives, and my parents negotiated a group photo that placed me at the edge of the frame, and I decided my silence needed a new job description, not defeat or martyrdom, but camouflage, because you cannot be undermined if no one quite understands where you are standing. So I wrote the numbers on a notepad that lived in my purse like a personal confession. I mapped the targets backward onto a 12-week plan that included early mornings, late nights, and an unromantic amount of spreadsheets. And I set about reintroducing myself to everyone at the office as the person who solved the problems other people forgot to notice. And I did it with the kind of pleasant tone that makes people underestimate you while you lift their whole project onto your back. Because in certain rooms, the best kind of ambition is the kind that smiles and takes notes and then tears through obstacles like a quiet storm, leaving only the results and the surprisingly clean break between before and after. The dessert plates had been cleared and the checks were being shuffled when I executed the other part of my petty, necessary victory, which involved slipping a crisp thank you card to the restaurant manager that praised the staff by name and mentioned how thrilled the star and his management team were with the evening, a note I knew would be tacked on the employee board and read by every server who had endured my family's booming voices and shifting demands, and perhaps that seems like a small thing, but sometimes the tightest knife is the one that cuts reputation rather than skin, and if my parents wanted a show, I was happy to give them a review that traveled farther than a single table. Back home, I replaced the bakery receipt on my refrigerator door with the bonus memo as if it were a vision board, and while I am not the type to chant affirmations, I did trace the key line with my finger. The one that promised eligibility for the highest tier if all criteria were met, and I heard a sound in my chest that felt like a door unlocking on its own, because maybe I would never get fireworks or confetti or a cake with my name piped in looping letters. But I had finally found a fuse I could light without asking for anyone's permission. The next morning, while the group chat lit up with passive-aggressive postmortems of my little stunt and reminders from my mother that family doesn't keep score, I opened my laptop to a message I had not expected, a short, polite note from someone at work who never apologized and never repeated themselves, and it contained a detail I had suspected but had not confirmed. There would be an internal reshuffle, one that placed me directly next to a person who had every incentive to undermine me, if it preserved their place, which meant the bonus was not simply a matter of effort, but of surviving a kind of office weather system that specialized in cheerful sabotage. And as I read it, I smiled without moving my mouth. Because while they were still arguing about a cake, the real show was quietly selling tickets, and my seat had just been upgraded to the front row. The week the reshuffle landed on my desk like a stack of unwashed dishes, I decided that if the company wanted me to sit shoulder to shoulder with a colleague whose favorite pastime was paving her own road with other people's work, then I would turn that arrangement into a laboratory where I studied her habits so closely that I could redesign the rules around them, and, because no one respects a rant as much as they respect results, I constructed a calendar that was part training plan, part petty manifesto, where every morning began before sunrise with a run that cleared my head, followed by a quiet hour at the kitchen table mapping milestones backward into tasks, and then a sequence of relentless check-ins with clients who had learned to expect cheerfulness, without flattery, and competence, without theatrics, all the while keeping my smile easy and my language calm. Since there is a particular power in being the person who never raises her voice, but still moves the furniture in a room. My newly adjacent colleague, let us call her Vanessa because that was her actual name, and I am tired of editing myself for the comfort of people who would not return the favor, specialized in charming introductions and disappearing follow-through. And she had a habit of volunteering me for background work while attaching her name to whatever deliverable could be paraded in front of leadership, which meant I spent the first 2 weeks behaving like a locksmith, quietly changing the mechanisms behind the doors she thought she controlled, and the trick was simple enough to be elegant. I shifted our project management into a space where audit trails were visible. I moved decisions into threadable channels where time-stamped summaries replaced hallway promises. And I trained our clients to recognize that the person who sent them a clear plan at the end of each day was the person steering the boat, even if the other passenger waved from the bow with perfect hair and a curated laugh. At home, I stitched the bonus criteria into my evenings the way a seamstress hides strength inside a hem, which is to say without fanfare, but with an attention to measurement that would make a carpenter blush, and since money is both tool and weapon. I also spent late nights on the real estate listings I had been quietly saving for years, building a private collection of coastal properties that did not scream fantasy as much as they whispered maybe, and I learned which neighborhoods had noisy neighbors and which streets carried their wind in a way that cooled your bones by late afternoon, and I color-coded a spreadsheet that tracked days on market and price adjustments and the history of owners who had gotten tired. Because sometimes a tired owner is the most merciful gatekeeper you can find. In the office, the weather improved because I brought my own climate, and that meant asking questions during meetings that made Vanessa smile too brightly while she searched for answers she had assumed I would fill in later. And it meant showing up to executive reviews with a deck that opened not with adjectives but with baselines. Then layering the graphs with a story that connected client pain to our revenue targets with the tidy ferocity of a prosecutor who refuses to be theatrical, and watching the faces tilt toward me with that subtle shift people make when they realize the person they used to overlook now has the keys in her hand. Afterward, Vanessa would pat my arm and whisper that we made a great team, which is a sentence people deploy when they need you to carry the piano and pretend it is a duet. Of course the sabotage arrived, because people who rely on fog cannot survive when the lights come on, and it took the form of a version-controlled file that somehow lost a critical assumption and a calendar invite that never found my inbox and a client who wrote to both of us with praise that mysteriously became praise for one, yet none of it landed the way she hoped because I had already trained the system to recognize the trail, and when our manager asked why an interim report seemed to drift off schedule, I forwarded the thread that documented my reminders and the timestamp from the shared workspace where the update should have lived, and I did this without adjectives, just the receipts, which is a chilly little magic trick that looks like grace from a distance and feels like iron up close. The bonus thresholds, which had looked ambitious bordering on arrogant when I first saw them, began to shimmer into reach as the quarter tilted past its midpoint. And while I am not so naive as to think hard work deserves reward in a world where theater is often paid more than construction, I could see the math stacking in my favor like a line of dominoes nudging the next one into motion. And that momentum created a quiet inside me that felt almost holy, the kind of silence you experience in a church at midday when the stained glass has turned the light into something soft and insistent. I stopped checking the group chat where my mother offered recipes for composure and where distant aunts posted photos of Ryan's lunches as if sandwiches could be accomplishments. And I stopped trying to make my father hear anything that was not about his son, and I focused instead on the elegant, stubborn truth that sometimes you do not need permission to move forward, you need a path you have measured with your own steps. On a Thursday that began with fog and ended with a sky so clear it looked ironed, the client we had fought hardest to keep renewed for a term longer than any of us had forecast. And the contract carried a clause that pushed our team's performance over the highest benchmark by a margin small enough to be thrilling and large enough to be undeniable. And when the confirmation email arrived, I was in a small conference room where the overheard light hummed and the thermostat clacked like an old wristwatch, and I felt my hands steady on the keyboard as I read the section that mattered: eligibility confirmed for the top tier of the pilot bonus, contingent on final verification. And I did not gasp or call anyone or text the group that would have minimized it. I simply breathed as if oxygen had finally reached a corner of my lungs that had been empty for years. That night, I opened the spreadsheet that had become my lullaby, and I filtered the coastal listings by something I had never dared to use before: properties I could buy now rather than someday. And a villa that had lingered because its photos were unflattering and its description undersold the view slid to the top of the page like a shy answer finally raised in class, and I clicked through each image, tracing the line where the ocean met the sky and the stone steps that twisted toward a balcony wide enough for forgiveness or solitude. And when I called the agent, a woman with a voice like sturdy rope, she said something that thinned the air around me until the room felt weightless. An offer had just fallen through. The owners were exhausted. and if I could move fast without drama, a clean bid would likely be accepted by Monday, which gave me exactly one business day and a weekend to prove that the years I had spent being overlooked had taught me the kind of patience that is not passive at all but coiled and ready. I stood there with the phone still against my ear, listening to the ocean I could not yet hear, and while the part of me trained by 1,000 small dismissals whispered that I should wait for a sign or consult a committee that had never voted in my favor, another part, the one that had been lighting matches in the dark, told me that the signal had already arrived, pulsing in my inbox and echoing across contracts and audit trails, and that if I hesitated now, it would not be prudence but fear, which wears a reasonable mask. So I thanked the agent, asked for the documents, and stared at the blank space on my kitchen wall where a set of keys could hang like a small, private meteor. In the morning, before anyone else could shape my day with their expectations or their urgencies, I would need a pre-approval letter, a conversation with a lender whose spoken numbers I could translate into air and water, and a bed that faced the horizon. And while the bonus had not been paid yet, the eligibility unlocked a door in the financing world that had been shut to me like every bakery window on every birthday night, which meant the path was narrow but navigable if I kept my balance. And as the midnight wind lifted the corner of the memo on my refrigerator, I realized that all the years of staying quiet had prepared me for this exact moment, the one where a whisper could become a signature and a long, patient ledger could flip into a single, decisive line. The following Monday did not arrive like an ordinary day where tasks stack up quietly and the hours move with the soft persistence of rain, but instead pressed down on me with the weight of everything I had been carrying for years. And as I walked into the office with my coffee cooling faster than usual, I understood that this was not just about contracts and spreadsheets or even the villa that waited like a half-whispered promise at the end of a long road. It was about whether I would finally allow myself to step into a life not defined by being the forgotten shadow at every family gathering. I had arranged the meeting with the lender early, and the man across the desk, gray-haired and careful with words, explained the numbers with the precision of a surgeon, slicing through interest rates and eligibility rules until the path ahead became something I could not mistake for wishful thinking. The bonus confirmation, though still pending its final stamp, had altered my profile so dramatically that what once seemed distant now sat in front of me in black and white, and as I signed the preliminary documents with a hand steady enough to surprise even myself, I realized I was doing more than claiming property. I was claiming a part of me my family had taught me to bury. The villa itself had lived for too long in someone else's disinterested hands, the agent had explained during our calls, and when I visited it in person. Driving down a winding coastal road where the horizon opened into a stretch of water so endless it could silence even the loudest memory, I felt a sense of recognition that was less about walls and windows and more about finally standing inside the image I had carried during those quiet years when I celebrated my victories alone. The stone steps leading up to the entrance were worn smooth by weather, the balcony carried the faint scent of salt even in the late afternoon, and the rooms were filled with light that seemed to know exactly where it belonged. Nothing about the place was extravagant in the way Ryan's parties had been. No fireworks, no chandeliers, no velvet ropes, yet in its stillness there was a grandeur that could never be bought with applause. By the time the papers were signed and the keys pressed into my palm, I no longer felt like I was buying a villa. I felt like I was finally buying back every silent moment I had been forced to endure, every slight that had been brushed aside, every candle that had been forgotten. When I returned home that evening, I sat down and wrote the kind of message that people underestimate until they see the storm it creates. I posted a photograph of the villa at sunset, the sky drenched in fire as if nature itself had prepared a delayed birthday gift, and I added a caption that was neither bitter nor pleading, but sharp enough to cut through years of dismissal. Sign the papers today. For those wondering, yes, it comes with fireworks every weekend. It was not literal, of course, but layered enough that everyone who knew me, everyone who had ever told me to stay quiet, would hear the double meaning. Within minutes, the silence that had defined so much of my life fractured into a chaos of buzzing notifications. My brother's messages arrived first, A sequence of half-jokes and half-accusations that read more like panic than humor, accusing me of showing off, of disrespecting the family tradition, of forgetting who had supported me, though the irony of that last claim nearly made me laugh. My parents followed quickly after, my mother with long, winding paragraphs about humility and the danger of making others feel small, my father with clipped reminders that family wealth should never be flaunted, even though none of his so-called family wealth had ever found its way into my pocket. At first, I thought I might feel guilt, that sharp stab of regret that comes when you break rules you have obeyed for too long, but instead what I felt was a widening clarity. The recognition that these furious messages were not about me at all, but about the mirror I had held up, the one that reflected their years of favoritism back at them in a single photograph of stone walls and ocean. The cousins chimed in, some with polite congratulations wrapped in curiosity, others with veiled questions about how I had managed it, and I answered no one, not because I was cruel, but because I understood the power of silence now belonged to me. For once, my silence was not submission, it was control. I poured myself a glass of wine, stood on the temporary balcony of my small apartment, and imagined the view that would soon replace it, the endless horizon where fireworks were not necessary because the sea itself carried its own kind of thunder. The night deepened, and the messages multiplied, paragraphs piling into my phone as if anger itself could undo the signature I had placed on the contract, and I scrolled without responding, letting the fury wash over me the way waves beat against a shore that never apologizes for standing its ground. I thought of every birthday when Ryan blew out candles under a sky filled with sparks, every graduation where my achievements were folded into the margins of his applause, every family dinner where my silence was mistaken for weakness. And I thought about the irony that it was my quiet perseverance, my long years of swallowing bitterness and working without spectacle, that had given me the one thing they could neither stage manage nor overshadow. It would have been easy to answer their accusations with anger, to remind them of every slight and every forgotten cake, but I realized my revenge was already complete the moment the first furious paragraph landed in my inbox. Because the true measure of power is not in the noise you make, but in the noise you cause others to make when you finally decide not to ask for their approval. I closed my phone, leaned back into the chair, and felt something I had not felt since childhood, not happiness, not triumph, but relief, the kind that comes when you finally step outside of a script you never agreed to perform. And just as I let my eyes close against the weight of the day, a new notification lit the screen, one that did not carry fury or disappointment, but something far stranger, a message from someone I had not expected at all. And its opening line was enough to make me sit up, wine glass trembling in my hand, because it suggested that my story with this family was not finished, not yet, and that the silence I thought I had mastered might soon be broken in a way I could not predict. The message that made my glass tremble did not arrive with anger or entitlement or any of the breezy jokes my brother used when he wanted to pretend the ground wasn't moving under his feet, but with a slow, careful apology from Hannah, who had married into the production years ago and had learned to carry boxes of party favors with one hand while steadying Ryan's ego with the other, and in a voice that kept pausing as if she were testing the strength of each word before stepping on it, she told me she had read my caption twice, and then a third time, and had realized I had not bragged so much as drawn a border, and that what spilled into my phone afterward was not disappointment in me, but fear that the border would hold. She asked to meet somewhere neutral, not for gossip and not for pity, but because she wanted to hand me something without sending it through the family's air, and I said yes to a cafe that sells croissants shaped like commas, since a pause felt appropriate after so many years of sentences I hadn't finished. Hannah arrived with her hair tied back and a portfolio that looked too formal for a cafe table, and after a breath that seemed to travel the whole way from her throat to the floor, she opened it to reveal a run of quiet documents that made my scalp sting. Not because they were sensational, but because they were ordinary in the way a blueprint is ordinary until you realize it is the map that built the house you've been trapped in. There were emails from my mother praising Hannah for stage management and reminding her to nudge me into taking group photos from the edge. There were receipts for fireworks charged to an account that Ryan had introduced to her as a family emergencies fund, And there was a thread I could not read twice in which my father explained to Ryan that minimizing my celebrations kept the ecosystem balanced, as if a daughter's pride were a natural disaster that required sandbags. Hannah slid me one more page, a short note she'd drafted to herself months ago, the words wobbly at the edges, promising that if I ever climbed out of the arrangement, she would tell me she was sorry for helping hold the ladder steady, and if I didn't, she would at least stop tightening the screws. She did not ask me to forgive her, which is what made me believe her. I did not publish the receipts, because the cleanest revenge is the kind that does not need witnesses to work, and because I understood that detonating her marriage to make a point would not be power so much as demolition. So instead, I used the documents like a private compass and turned them toward a plan that felt both merciless and generous, which is to say I wrote 2 letters and made 1 purchase, and each of those actions would be felt without spectacle. The letters were not essays or indictments. They were boundary stones with polite language sanded onto their edges, one to my parents describing the terms under which I would be willing to see them: quiet dinners, equal acknowledgement, no fireworks of any kind. Literal or metaphorical, a single cake on a single table with names written in the same hand, and one to Ryan, which contained a sentence I had never allowed myself to send, telling him that I no longer accepted participation in the show, and that any future relationship would require him to stop headlining me out of my own life. Neither letter invited reply, which is why the replies came anyway, and when they arrived, I filed them behind Hannah's documents like specimens in a museum that no longer allowed tours. The purchase was a calendar reservation and a set of simple orders for a Saturday 2 weeks later at the villa, where I arranged for a local nonprofit to bring a handful of girls who had been bounced from celebration to celebration without ever being the reason for the room to gather. And I paid for cakes that were not stacked like architecture, but made with the kind of attention that puts dignity ahead of height, and I placed sparklers in a jar on the balcony with a note that said they could light them only after they made a wish, and only if they were willing to keep the wish, not the sparkler, which seemed like a reasonable trade. I did not post a flyer or tag the charity or arrange a photographer, though a volunteer snapped a single picture of the girls laughing on the steps and sent it to me later with a caption that did not gush, but simply said firsts. And I stood at the edge of the balcony and felt the sea move like a patient animal, and understood that this was the noise I had been wanting all my life. My phone pulsed during the small party with messages that grew more frantic the longer I ignored them, and somewhere around sunset, when the horizon folded into a color that has no name because it belongs only to evenings that choose not to brag about themselves, another message slid onto the screen with the thoughtful timing of a question that has learned how to wait. A text from my mother that said they were in the car and almost at the gate and only wanted to talk, and that if I let them in, they would keep their voices low. I could have walked down the steps, I could have opened the gate, I could have used the evening to conduct a negotiation about the future that might or might not hold. Yet behind me a girl was carefully setting down a slice of cake and telling another girl that she finally believed wishes were not a test you failed, but a muscle you learned. And I realized that some conversations improve if you do not hold them when the other party is expecting triumph or collapse. I switched the phone to silent and watched the girls light the thin wires. Their faces briefly illuminated the way mine had never been when I stood at the edges of my brother's shows. And in that brightness I understood that the loudest revenge is not the public correction of a story, but the quiet rewriting of it, line by line, until the ending presses gently on the page where it used to slam. The gate camera recorded headlights that idled and then reversed. The wind raised the corner of the napkins like a hand offering a wave, and Hannah's last message, "Thank you for not making me collateral. I am finding my way," arrived like a lantern slid across a dark river. I did not reply that night, and I did not decide anything forever, and when the final sparkler sighed into smoke, I stood with the lighter in my palm and considered the kind of phone call I might make tomorrow or next week or never. Which is to say, I left the question where it belonged, in the space between the water and the sky, where light knows how to do its work without asking who deserves it.